Private Gerald F. Sullivan reporting for duty, General. Hello there, Sully here, the retired tanker yanker for my life after trucking. Before I start today's video, there's going to be changes coming. First of all, I'm going to change the name of this channel from Sully the Retired Tanker Yanker to simply my name, Jerry Sullivan. Apparently Google won't let me do it because I changed the name within the past 90 days, and that's a violation of their rules, so I might have to wait a couple weeks to do that, but be on the lookout for that. Content, as I said, less music, more information. I plan on tackling issues which are vital to the trucking industry and which are vital to truckers. I'm probably going to do another video on that myth known as the driver shortage. And I'm also going to talk about the conduct of drivers on the road and the conduct of trucking companies towards drivers on the road. Today is July 1st, 2019. On this day, 126 years ago, the Battle of Gettysburg began. It was a 3-day battle which is called the turning point of the Civil War. It was Lee's intention to march north into Pennsylvania and capture a major rail hub, most likely Harrisburg. The idea was if he could capture Harrisburg, he could move east, take Philadelphia, turn south, take Baltimore, take Washington, and the war would be over. And his Army of Northern Virginia, coming off victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, firmly believed that they could do that. They believed that they could accomplish that goal. Now, every man and his dog knew that the Yankees vastly outnumbered the Confederates. They had more resources. Lee thought by attacking in the east, the Union would be forced to send troops from the Western Theater, particularly Vicksburg, which was being assaulted by General Ulysses S. Grant. Vicksburg was important because it was a river town, it was a port town, and it seemed that the Union was pretty much controlling the Mississippi River. So anyway, after Chancellorsville, which was in May of 1863, Lee turned north and started marching towards Pennsylvania. Lee did suffer one unfortunate casualty in Chancellorsville, which was the death of General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was killed by friendly fire. Well, he was shot by friendly fire. He died of pneumonia, actually. But with that loss, Lee had to break up the Stonewall Brigade under two other generals, mainly Ewell and Pickett. And of course he had Longstreet, his old warhorse as he called him. And with this force, he really thought that he could make an assault on a northern city. Lincoln ordered the Army of the Potomac under the command of General Joseph Hooker to flank Lee on his way up to Pennsylvania and to keep the army between Lee and Washington, D.C. Hooker begrudgingly moved the army, and when Lincoln and his Supreme Commander, General Halleck, realized this, Hooker was relieved, and General George Meade was placed in command of the Army of the Potomac. Meade had been the commander of the 5th Corps, and probably the most senior of the generals, so it was pretty much a no-brainer. Lee decided to concentrate his forces at Gettysburg But a cavalry division under the command of General John Buford arrived and valiantly held off. Buford, however, realized that without reinforcement, the rebels would win the day. Fortunately, the Second Corps, under the command of General John Reynolds, showed up, and they provided support to Buford's cavalry. Unfortunately, Reynolds was killed, but the idea was to defend Union lines. Basically, the Confederates prevailed that day, and the Union forces had to retreat. It was the second day of the battle when the forces finally arrived in full number, and the Union set out a line which kind of resembled a fishhook. Second day had fierce fighting. One of the fiercest battles was the Peach Orchard, which was being defended by General Sickles. Now, Sickles was famous prior to his involvement in the Civil War because he murdered the lover of his wife, who was a nephew of Francis Scott Key. Sickles pleaded temporary insanity and was acquitted. This was the first time in the history of American jurisprudence that a defendant in a crime was acquitted on the basis of insanity. Now, Sickles' job was to defend the Peach Orchard, but he believed there was a break in the line and sent forces to fill this break, and they advanced on the Confederates. This created a real break, and Sickles was wounded. He was hit with a cannonball, and he lost his leg. But under the pressure of battle, Sickles remained cool. In fact, as he was being treated, they placed a tourniquet on his leg so he wouldn't bleed to death. He just sat back very calmly, lit up a cigar, and eventually he was never charged with dereliction of duty for his blunder at the Peach Orchard. Another significant battle on the second day was Little Round Top. The 5th Corps was defending the far left of the Union line, and the unit to the farthest left was the 20th Maine, under the command of Colonel Joshua L. Chamberlain. Chamberlain was not a West Pointer, he was a scholar. He was a professor of rhetoric and revealed religion at Bowdoin College in Maine. He volunteered for the Army and received a commission from the governor. And when the 20th Maine was formed, he was given the rank of executive officer under the command of Colonel Albert Ames. After Fredericksburg, Ames was promoted, and Chamberlain was eventually given command of the 20th Maine, and just after Chancellorsville, he was promoted to the rank of full colonel. Ordered to defend the left of the Union line at all costs, Chamberlain deployed his men, spread them out as thin as possible. His unit which had originally had 1,000, was down to less than 400. He did have the benefit of receiving additional troops when soldiers from the 2nd Maine, which had been disbanded, were sent to his command. Now, these soldiers thought that when the 2nd Maine was disbanded, their service was over, but they had signed 2-year enlistment papers, and they were told, go fight with the 20th Maine or be lined up against the wall and shot. And all but 3 of those so-called mutineers did fight with the 20th Maine. They were short on ammunition, they were short on food, they were tired, they had just completed a long march to get to Gettysburg. And Chamberlain was forced to send his troops out as far as he could. And units from Alabama were coming up Little Round Top, and they repulsed them at every stand. Finally, they were just about out of ammunition, and the Alabamans were ready to make another assault when Chamberlain ordered his troops to fix bayonets. He then pulled out a textbook maneuver called the swinging gate, where he deployed his troops out and ordered a pivot point where the colors were posted and wanted the army to swing down and to the right to prevent the Alabamans from flanking him. And it worked. Chamberlain personally captured the commander of one of these units. He was holding his saber at the man's throat. The man was holding his pistol. He pulled the trigger, fired, but the pistol wasn't loaded. He then handed Chamberlain his sword and surrendered. After that battle, Chamberlain's 20th Maine was relieved, and they were sent back to the center of the line. Chamberlain had a very heartfelt meeting with his new corps commander, General Hancock, who was kind of disturbed because he knew that Pickett's brigades were forming on the other side of the field, and in command of one of those brigades was his dearest and best friend, General Lewis Armistead. Now, Hancock had already lost another dear friend at Gettysburg in Reynolds, and he was not happy about the idea of having to face one of his dearest friends in battle. But the third day of the battle was Pickett's charge. Lee decided that the best place to attack the Union Army was right in its middle. He ordered Longstreet to set up his brigades under Pickett, Johnson, Pettigrew, Ewell, and they were going to all converge on the center. Now, they started off by bombarding the Union forces. They started an artillery barrage. The idea was to soften the Union defenses at the center. The Confederates had approximately 150 guns, and every single one of them fired. Cannon fire subsided around 3 p.m., and 12,500 Southern soldiers stepped off and marched across an open field. The advance was approximately 3/4 of a mile. Now, these units were facing flanking fire, but still they marched on. When they got into distance of musket fire, the Union soldiers opened up. They had a stone wall to hide behind, just like the rebels did at Fredericksburg. They were able to pretty much pick off the soldiers. As soon as they got in the range of artillery fire, the cannon began firing shells, and when they got close enough, the cannon began firing canister. The Confederates breached the Union lines only at one point. It was called the Angle. Lewis Armistead led his troops over the stone wall at the Angle, placed his hat on his saber, and urged his troops forward. They were in the process of capturing a gun when Armistead was fired on and shot. Approached by a Union soldier, he asked that soldier to deliver a message to General Hancock, and the message was, "Tell him General Armistead sends his regrets." What he didn't know was that Hancock had also been hit. Hancock was on his horse, and one of his lieutenants urged him to take cover when Hancock uttered the immortal phrase, "There are times when a corps commander's life doesn't matter." Hancock did receive first aid. A tourniquet was placed on his wound, and he survived. Armistead did not survive. Now, as far as Pickett's charge goes, Longstreet strongly disagreed with the action, and he told Lee so. But Lee was convinced that it would work. And probably there wasn't a single general on the battlefield, with the possible exception of Pickett, who didn't know that the charge was folly. Pickett saw a chance for glory. Now, what people don't know about Pickett, or you may know this, was that in his class at West Point, Pickett finished dead last. As he often said, he wasn't much for the scholarly life. He wasn't much for the fancy book learning. He was a soldier. He fought in California, he fought in Mexico. He was a fighter. Well, Pickett's charge failed, and as the Confederate troops retreated, they were pretty much decimated. Pickett had been, well, he had his horse shot out from under him, and he was on foot when General Lee rode up and said, "General, reform your division." Pickett said, "General, I have no division." And forever after, Pickett had no respect for Robert E. Lee. In fact, when he went to visit Robert E. Lee on his deathbed as he was leaving, he told his companion, "That old man had my division slaughtered." Now, the aftermath of Gettysburg was pretty much that the Confederacy was starting to come with grips to the fact that they were going to lose this war. The Union just had superior numbers, they had superior supply, and basically the Union was fighting the war with one hand tied behind their back, and Gettysburg proved it. Sheer numbers and sheer logistics was what won the Battle of Gettysburg. But Meade made a fatal mistake. He allowed Lee to retreat and escape. Had he concentrated his forces as Lee was making his way back to Virginia towards the Potomac, he could have destroyed Lee and ended the war right then and there. Instead, he chose to let a 17-mile-long train of soldiers, of casualties, of horses and mules, of livestock, of equipment, materiel, Meade allowed that train to pass across the Potomac. Lincoln was furious. This was an opportunity to end the war, and Meade let it slip by. Now, on July 3rd, the day of Pickett's charge, there was a little skirmish going on in Mississippi called Vicksburg. Vicksburg was being defended by a Northern man, believe it or not. General John C. Pemberton of Philadelphia. Now, why was Pemberton fighting for the Confederacy? Well, when he was at West Point, he fell in love with the sister of his roommate, who was from Virginia. And he had Southern sympathies because of his wife's family. Grant, whose wife had Southern sympathies, felt no such compulsion. Grant was a federal soldier. He was a general. His job was to defend Union forces. His job was to attack and take Vicksburg. Now, that campaign took a little bit longer, but it was finally on July 3rd, 1863, that Vicksburg fell. Pemberton was ready to ask for terms. And when the soldiers under him said, "Well, what terms do you think you can get?" He said, "Well, tomorrow's the 4th of July, and I'm a Northern man. I think I can get the best possible terms I can on July 4th. Well, the terms he got was unconditional surrender. Pemberton submitted his resignation to Jefferson Davis, and it was accepted. Pemberton did re-enter the war shortly thereafter, but as an artillery colonel. And after the war, he returned to Philadelphia, where he died. He used cocaine to ease war wounds that he had, and eventually died from the cocaine addiction that he had. Pemberton, ironically, is buried in the same cemetery as George Meade, Laurel Hill Cemetery. On his grave, you will see Confederate flags. And Pemberton's grave is as much a part of a tour of Laurel Hill Cemetery as Meade's grave. Well, anyway, the Battle of Gettysburg, the high water mark for the Union, the turning point of the war. A national cemetery was established to bury the dead who fell there. And in November of 1863, Abraham Lincoln was invited to the dedication. The featured speaker was a man named Edward Everett. And Everett, famous orator, famous speechmaker, spoke for 2 hours. Then Lincoln got up and spoke for 2 minutes. Everett later said that he wished he could have said in the 2 hours he spoke what Lincoln said in the 2 minutes he spoke. The words that Lincoln spoke probably emboldened the Union cause for the rest of the war. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. For my life after trucking, this is Sully, the retired tanker yanker. Safe and happy travels.